I feel like the takeaway from that little bit there is divorce lawyer says prenups are going to help you determine what kind of person, because you can't hide anymore. You can't lie. So therapists really hear what people feel in a marriage, but divorce lawyers see what people do when it ends. And when you start looking at what people do, right, not what they say, you're going to see a whole different side about why marriages actually fall apart, especially when power and control are involved. So today I am joined by family law lawyer Justin Lee. And you may have seen his videos online. He's super funny and he reacts to like relationship situations and just sort of breaks things down. So we're going to talk about what divorce lawyers see that therapists don't, right? The games, the entitlement, all of these red pill myths and all of that. But I would first love to have you sort of introduce yourself a little bit. How long have you been a family law lawyer and what got you into this specialty?
Well, thanks for having me on, Lisa, first of all. And it's a funny story how I got into family law in the first place. And this is not a joke. At the time I was applying to law school, thinking about applying to law school, Suits was a very, very popular program. And the young me thought, you know what, I think I could be one of those charismatic characters, advocating for people and making lots of money. And so I was in accounting at the time. And by chance, I applied to law school. I got in. And there was just a program that the school was offering that they got students to participate in family law related programs. And I thought to myself, how funny would it be if I could tell my friends and family that I'm a divorce lawyer? The concept was just so funny to me. And in the beginning, almost as a joke, I applied. I somehow got it. And ever since then, I fell in love with the industry and I've never looked back. But I mean, at the end of the day, it is also true that I like relationships. I like drama. I always tell my friends, look, I mean, being a divorce lawyer is kind of like listening to your friends vent about their relationship problems, which everybody knows it's very, very fun to be that third person listening, but you get paid to do it.
Right.
Not
more
quite
than a
the
therapy,
same,
by the way.
unfortunately, but that's right. That's right. I'm a very expensive therapist. I know a lot of, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, being a divorce lawyer, part of it inevitably becomes being a therapist for your clients. And yeah, the clients always tell me, you're good, Justin, but you're also very expensive. I'm like, I tell you to go get a therapist and to talk about your problems that are not legal with them instead of me. But sometimes they need a quick job.
Yeah, I get that. I can see why people would sort of feel compelled to be like, oh my God, this is what he did, or just like getting so angry. And you're like, okay, but legally speaking, and you have to sort of bring it back.
That's right.
Yeah, it's tricky. Divorce is something that, my audience has certainly experienced or will experience, at the very least, breakups. But I think this kind of concept that you see a lot online of like women file for divorce more. And in your experience, why do women file for divorce and why do men file for divorce?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to preface what I'm about to say with that, at the end of the day, and this is the case for every divorce lawyer, we only see a very small subset of divorce filings, let's say, and I happen to specialize in high conflict divorce. And so the people who come to me usually are people who like really, really, really do not get along and they need to go to court and they need serious intervention, so to speak. And so my sample size is not quite representative of what the actual stats might be on whole, right? But from my perspective, what I see is that women, their decision to get a divorce it's a product of having had a very, very long period of time of suffering, mistreatment, just not being happy in a relationship, and having really, really, really tried to make it work, but they realize at the end of the day that it's just not salvageable. And I think on the flip side of that is that men are, generally speaking, they can be a bit more oblivious to the problems in the marriage. And so I think that's where we get the whole joke on TikTok and Instagram about how men will say, like, I never saw the divorce coming. But then from the woman's perspective, they saw it from a mile away because they were unhappy from the beginning. And so I think from my experience, women file for divorce more than men. And I think when men are looking to get a divorce, it's as a result of something that happened in a shorter period of time, maybe something more acute, like an affair by the women or something like that. But it's more of a quicker decision for men than it is for women, in my experience.
Yeah, I can see that actually. I know my clients are women and they are like, I've been begging this man for years to stop being controlling or to be more participative or do more around the house or love me more, spend more time with me. Or, I deal in abuse and toxic relationships, so obviously stop abusing her. But I think there's also a denial that what he's doing is abuse. And related, unrelated, these men know that they're abusive. They know that their behavior is bad. They just sort of I don't understand and pretend that they don't get it. And then they pull this women are crazy and she divorced me out of nowhere. I feel like women didn't change fundamentally, the sort of view of she changed. I think that women in these bad relationships, they change because they're reacting to mistreatment or neglect over time. So yeah, she's become different, I'm sure. But he might have stopped wooing her or started abusing her, and then she's getting the hell out of there. So you deal in high conflict, which is so interesting. When you have a female client, let's say, who's divorcing someone and citing abuse or high conflict or narcissism, whatever, can you tell on the other side, when you're dealing with their lawyer, can you see in the filings and in the emails and all the things, do you feel like you can tell if he's abusive?
That's tough. I think a lot of the times the really abusive, really nefarious type of people on the other side can also be very, very charming. And on the outside, they can come across as very put together, very professional. We're talking about real, functioning members of society who we might even look up to because of the status they have in the society, what have you. And so it's not always easy to tell that this person is, it could be, or is, as my client would allege that they are abusive or whatever. But being a divorce lawyer, you have the privilege of, pulling the curtain back, so to speak. And you get to see the unfiltered version of their relationship dynamic, right? From emails, text messages, old testimonies from other people. They're evidence that are so contrary to how they present themselves on the outside that it's a real problem. And Lisa, you hit on a really good point. And that was one of the things I wanted to talk about on this podcast because I thought it was so important. I had a consult the other day, and it was a woman who was telling me about the abusive situation that she's in. And, I asked her, so you're talking about all these emotional and mental abuse, which by the way, it's same thing as physical abuse. I want everybody to know that. And I asked her, what about physical violence and physical harm? Do you have any concerns of physical safety? And she said, no, he never hit me. He'll just sometimes grab me and push me, but he never hit me. And I said to myself, but this is exactly the problem, right? There are women who I think out of defense mechanism are underplaying what the situation is that they find themselves in. And, I need everybody to know that unwanted contact, whether it's a fingertip to your arm or a full-on swing and a smack, is all the same. Unwanted contact by your spouse is assault. And there's nothing appropriate about somebody saying, we're trying to measure what kind of assault is viable assault, and that warrants you doing something about. And it just hit me because in that moment I realized how many women are out there experiencing this exact same thing where they're trying to self-justify that the situation that they're in is not as bad as it actually is. He only pushes me sometimes. He doesn't actually hit me. What a ridiculous statement, right? And there's real need for awareness for people to know that that's a situation that they're in. And I guess by doing these kind of podcasts and putting this information out there, I guess what we're trying to do is letting people know that, it's not okay, and it's okay for you to leave, and it's okay for you to do something about it.
People need to know that, and I hear something so often that abuse has no relevance in family court. And I just don't agree. I think that you can present it poorly in court. And I hope that good lawyers can present it properly. But how you could possibly say it's not relevant, especially when you're talking about children, which this episode's not really about that, but it is relevant. But even in a divorce proceeding, I think that a lawyer needs to know that abuse has been present, because then you're aware of these games. And I could list so many games, but the paperwork punishment, dragging things out, refusing to sign the agreements, the verbal agreements that the couple might make, and then come to the lawyers and be like, okay, draw this up. And then the husband's like, I'm not signing that. We just agreed. I see it so often, these games. What games do you see as a lawyer? What do you sort of see as the, let's say, the perpetrator of abuse is playing through their lawyer?
Well, a lot of the times it's financial. A lot of the times, women who find themselves as a victim of domestic violence, they're also financially deprived in one way or another. And so the man would usually have financial control. And so, that means that she has to depend on him, not only for just cost of living on a day-to-day basis, but to get a lawyer. Like he's got the resources to get a good lawyer, and she's scrambling to find every dollar she can to try and get any kind of lawyer. That already creates a very imbalanced dynamic, a power dynamic. Like financial abuse is very, very real. Even when you do take them to court, there's all these tactics to delay the process, to use the system to their advantage. I always say to people, because I think people sometimes have this misconception that we have this perfect justice system. We don't. And I don't think that's possible. We're at the end of the day, a society made up by humans, driven by humans, for humans. Like we're not perfect, right? And we only have one legal system and it's not perfect. And there are ways for somebody to take advantage of that. Now, I don't want anybody hearing this to get discouraged by that, because at least where I'm from in Ontario, the justice system, while not perfect, it is very, very comprehensive. In my experience, justice usually always does prevail, but it takes time to get there. It takes a lot of resources to get there. It takes a lot of emotional toll to get there. So it really is as they say, a marathon and not a sprint.
Yeah, it's so true. I know the amount of women that I deal with who, some are dealing with divorce with children, some without, but you still see a lot of the same tactics. I think when there's children involved, obviously there's the weaponization of children and alienation and all that, but the financial abuse is huge, even in child support, spousal support, if it's even owed, which I realize it's not always the case, but there's just this dragging out of the process, takes years, it takes an amount of money that would make some people sick. The amount of women that are like, I don't know where I'll get the money from, or, I'm representing myself, or I'm trying to represent myself. And they just feel like the system is so rigged against women. And then it's so odd to me, because then on the flip side, men are like, get out of here. It's so rigged for women. And when I look at stats, I just can't see how it's rigged for women, especially given that men run the system and we're living in a patriarchy. I can't imagine how men are losing at a game that they've rigged to win. It makes no sense to me. And I think the stats that I see sort of don't support that it's rigged for women. But I love that you're sort of seeing fair outcomes are happening. Like people need to hear that, because it doesn't matter that you're from Ontario.
Eventually.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, how can I can't really speak to any other jurisdiction other than Ontario, because I don't practice outside of Ontario. And look, jurisdiction differences are huge. And at the end of the day, a state of Texas is going to have a very different set of rules and laws than Ontario does, for example. And what I've heard through the grapevine is that some states may have a bit more antiquated set of laws that might work against one gender over the other. But again, I can't speak to that because I don't know for sure. What I can say though, for example, in Ontario, and just generally what I see is, and I think the reason why you're getting the sense that everybody seems to be saying like, oh, the system's rigged against me, even though when we think about it logically, it can't both be true, is that family law at the end of the day, when you do reach any kind of settlement or when a judge makes an order, usually what happens is you both lose something, right? Like we have a saying in family law where if you're trying to get into a settlement, your goal should be for both of you to walk away equally unhappy, right? And if you think about it, like at the end of the day, when you're going through a divorce process, your best case scenario, you end up with a quote unquote broken family. Like you're now a divorced family. And that's not an ideal scenario at the end of the day. And so it's very, very hard for anybody going through the process at the other side of it to feel like they've won or they've got the ideal outcome, right? And so it's very easy for somebody to feel like the system's been rigged against them or that they got the shorter end of the stick, or what have you, right? And so I think that might explain why, even if factually the system might be favoring one, set of people over the other, that both sides feel like the system's rigged against them.
Yeah. I remember actually it was a couples counselor once said that compromise is tricky because often both people are unhappy. So you have to make sure that you're not compromising yourself. Now, that was from a therapist in the context of helping a relationship survive. But when you sort of apply that to divorce, it's like, compromise sucks. Everybody's losing something. So that's arguably a fair way to look at it, because at least everybody's losing something. It's suppose maybe they're both gaining something too, but I think there's a myth that one side loses more. But
I think it's hard to appreciate, as somebody going through the process, that you are gaining something for sure. I think you're likely to overemphasize what you're losing, what they're gaining versus the other side of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you always wanted more, more custody, more support, more money, more something, more than half of the house or something. And there's so much context that's needed, right? I mean, like, was it a stay-at-home mom? Was it a wealthy couple? Was it people who don't have a lot of money? Kids, no kids? How long were they married? I'm sure there's lots of factors that.
Also, let's be frank, it's so emotionally charged, this process, that there are probably a lot of people who, no matter what the outcome is, they are still going to feel like they've lost,
Yeah.
That all they want to see is that the other person is destroyed. And if that's your objective, you're never going to be satisfied.
There's definitely, this feeling that I see so many clients experience this, that they know that their spouse or ex-spouse wants them to lose. And something that I feel like I've really learned about people who are narcissistic, and I know that word is used a lot in family court and probably should never be used, but dealing with somebody who's abusive or narcissistic, they want to win. And of course, and they want you to lose. But if them losing, if that's what it takes that you lose as well, I think that they're willing often to burn their own lives to the ground just so that
100%.
you also lose. Yeah, like if I'm
and
going down
too,
with both.
Yeah. Like there are, generally speaking, two types of lawyers, okay? And I know I said I deal in high conflict divorce, but genuinely my philosophy and my practice is I care more about your well-being and your ability to provide for your own children than patting my own pocket. And what that means is I would rather you settle and reach an outcome that minimizes you burning away your savings, even if it means you might have to compromise, over drawing out this fight and this litigation where you're going to spend tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on me and for nothing to show for it. And I tell people, look, the longer you fight, I will tell you, there is a clear winner and a loser. Okay? The winner is me, and then the loser is you, right? No, if you want to fight, go ahead, because I'm going to be, very comfortable, making money in my profession. But at the end of the day, if you think there's a winner and a loser between you and your spouse, you're absolutely wrong. There's only going to be two losers, and that's the both of you. There are going to be two winners. That's me and the other side's lawyer. And let's not forget, there's a real biggest loser and a victim in all this, which is the children. And that's what's so funny about human emotions, is that no matter how much I preach that to people who really need to get their mindset right, they don't care. They can't, maybe it's not that they don't care, they can't get themselves there in their mind, that they genuinely would rather, they need to satiate their need to, get the other side.
Yeah, exactly. To get at them. I wanted to ask, actually, have you ever had what I'm going to call the narcissistic client? Have you been the lawyer for the other side, for the perpetrator ever?
Maybe when I was working at a firm and I was, more of a supporting lawyer than the main lawyer. I've been on my own for a bit now, and because I put out a lot of this information online and I make content, I think the clients that are drawn to me in the first place are ones that kind of see the kind of person and the lawyer I am, which is, I'd like to think that I'm empathetic and I try to do right by my clients. And so, genuinely, in the recent years that I've been on my own, I don't think I've ever had any. I've had a lot of victims of abuse, I think, which, that makes sense because of the contents I put out. Yeah.
Yeah, which sucks. But I appreciate that there's lawyers out there that know. So hey, if you're in Ontario, here's a lawyer for you. Because people are constantly talking about how my lawyer has no idea. I know many people who have hired a lawyer and said, listen, I know you don't want to hear all about my drama. I understand you're not my therapist, but my ex is a narcissist. I'm not going to make that the whole center of my case, but I need you to know that, because we need to be proactive. We need to be, offense, not defense. And the lawyers are yeah. They don't agree, or they're oh, everybody calls their ex a narcissist. And then they don't operate from what I think is the right framework. I don't know this whole lawyers being a shark or aggressive, but I would say that I like an assertive lawyer. I think that's important. And knowing some of the history, knowing that there's been domestic violence. Can you imagine taking a client and them not even telling you that there was domestic violence?
Yeah, no, that's a very multi-layered problem, right? At the end of the day, if you think about, what stuff family lawyers have to deal with, it's actually not, it's actually very, very complicated. And inevitably, you're going to do some job as a therapist. You're going to be social worker in one hand, and you're going to be a financial advisor on the other hand. You have to take on so many roles as a family lawyer, but you're not technically trained to do any of that, right? And so I'm not surprised when you say that there are a lot of lawyers from people around you that have experienced just their lawyers not being in tune with what it is that they are looking for or what they are going through. But on the other side of that, and I see this often as well, is that people also need to have realistic expectations. What you as a client find to be actionable offense by the other person, that threshold is probably very, very different than what the court, for example, would consider to be actionable offense. And so as a lawyer, your job is to give them the transparency and realistic assessment of their situation. And so when a lawyer tells them, well, look, I hear you when you say your ex did this and this and that, but legally speaking, here's your situation and how that might not be as relevant as you think, et cetera, et cetera. And I think sometimes people have a hard time accepting that advice and they interpret that as, no, they don't quite see where I'm coming from. Now, I think part of that also is communication issues, right? Like the lawyer needs to know how to communicate that in a way that makes sure that the client feels heard, but still convey
totally dismissed.
the right advice. So again, I think it's a very multi-layered problem.
It's always like, I find it hard to say this because I'm a survivor of this, and I know what it feels like to not feel like the system cares and to feel like lawyers just want your money. But you said something so interesting about like, I could pad my bank account all day long, but you don't want to go to court. That's like you encourage people to settle. People don't think that about lawyers. People think that lawyers, and I would argue a lot of people think all lawyers want to go to court. You want to litigate so badly, you're just going to drag this out. That's not my experience with lawyers. I think that you probably have a busy practice, which, especially if you specialize in high conflict divorce, that sucks. I wish you didn't have such a busy practice. I wish less people were getting divorced for these reasons. But you probably have lots of cases and you're actually not trying to drag this out. You're giving them honest information about what matters in this jurisdiction and what doesn't matter and what to not build your case around and what to build your case around. And people are like, Justin doesn't care. They immediately sort of feel like the lawyers are to blame or that lawyers want to get rich, but it takes the focus off the fact that a perpetrator, an abuser in court divorcing you wants you to lose and wants to drag things out. And there's probably lots beyond your control.
Yeah, I mean, look, if my objective was to make a lot of money, I wouldn't be a family lawyer. Let's just put it that way. Okay? I think there was like a survey done across Canada a few years ago. And apparently the finding was that family lawyers were the most underpaid and the most stressed. And so again, like if I wanted to make money, I wouldn't be here. So, let's start with that.
You'd be Harvey Specter.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I always joke that I'm like the dentist who's trying to get you to floss. Like, yes, it's probably not a good incentive for me to tell you to do the right things. But you know what? I care about your teeth. I care about your life, and that's why I'm in this field. Because I care about people and I want to make the right differences. I will say, Lisa, sorry, I because I think this is so important. Like, I want people to also know that I'm not in the minority. There are a lot of family lawyers I know who feel the exact same way, and they genuinely want to do good things for people. And as a pro tip, I guess, when you're looking for a lawyer, you need to speak with multiple lawyers. And I think precisely for this reason, like if you speak to one and if you're like, well, I talked to one, and they sound okay, so I'm just going to go with them. You might be stuck with a lawyer who's not aligned with you in terms of how your case needs to be run. And so, I always recommend to people, at least 3 lawyers. And there are people who offer free consultations, and there are people who will charge. And I think, spend the money if you can, and talk to lawyers, because if you spend the money, they'll give you the time of the day and actually give you quality information. And for example, I tell my clients, I tell my potential clients after I consult, I tell them look, I want to be very clear. Just because you spoke with me and consulted with me, there's zero pressure for you to retain me. I want you to go out and talk to other people and see for yourself who is your best fit. That might not be me. If it is me, great. I'm happy to help you. If it's not, also great. I'm much better off knowing that you found somebody who's better for you than I am. And so everybody needs to have that kind of mindset and talk to more than one. And I think you might have a better luck finding the right lawyer for you.
Yeah. You're making me think about this woman. It was years ago when I first started in this, and I don't work in any legal capacity, but I do talk to a lot of people about divorce. And she said she had this in her mind. She was told to talk to 3 lawyers. So she consulted with 3 lawyers, and one was okay. One straight up said to her, you have no case. All of the abuse that you're describing, even though it happened in front of the children, it's historical. It has no relevance. You need to go 50-50. And this is in Ontario. And you've got no case whatsoever. Like, stop. Let him see the children. I get you think that he's going to hurt them or that he's committed acts of physical violence in front of them, but like, get over it. You're going to lose. And this woman was like, oh my God, scared out of her mind, goes to the third consultation. And that lawyer was like, no, you don't have to do 50-50. You have a pretty good case. I understand you feel like your ex is a narcissist, but at the very least, labels aside, there's provable abuse that has taken place, and let's take a shot at this. So obviously she chose that lawyer. But meanwhile, she ended up with full decision-making and full custody. And I think back to, but that first lawyer who was like, you're going to lose, you can't, like, what? It was shocking to me. Like, how'd you miss that so badly? She allegedly, right, I wasn't there, but presented the exact same information to both of the lawyers. So it's just also interesting how some lawyers are like, not on your side right off the bat.
That's a very good case in point, right? That why you need to speak with multiple lawyers. Yeah. Because it's a very, very human issue, I think it's different than something like being a doctor where there's a little bit more of that black and white element for a medical diagnosis than there is in a human relationship diagnosis, right? And you can take it to 10 different lawyers. They're probably going to have 10 different opinions about how to run your case. And so again, more to the point that you need to talk to more lawyers than not.
Do you see women getting rich off divorce? I'm not saying have you had a case here and there, but fundamentally, do you feel like women just profit off divorce?
It's a hard question to answer because to answer that question, I think we need to first answer, well, what do we collectively agree is an appropriate compensation for a woman who stereotypically and generally speaking, I think to this day, this is still true, at least in the demographic that's getting a divorce, were stay-at-home parents, or if they were working, they were part-time. They were responsible for majority of the childcare, and they sort of supported the man's career by taking care of all the admin duties so that he didn't have to. What is the appropriate compensation for that sacrifice and contribution that she made, right? Some might say, well, you literally wouldn't have the children you have without her support. So, you giving away half of what you have is a pretty good deal. Another person might say, well, he had the job already prior to getting married, and he put in a lot of effort to try and climb the corporate ladder. And yes, it did help that she was making lunches for the children and taking them to school, what have you. But at the end of the day, he was the one putting in the work towards his career to make it advance. And so what do you mean I need to now give her 50% of everything, right? So as you can see, there's a very, James Sexton, for example, is a very prominent New York lawyer who's on TikTok all the time. And I love this guy. And he, said something really interesting about this whole concept of spousal support, right? Which is, so we're going to say that because she stayed home and supported your career that you have to pay her spousal support. But what about then her own parents who supported her and made her to be the person that she is, and therefore she was able to support his career? So then does he now owe some kind of compensation to her parents? And what about her parents? It's a bit of I suppose, a silly illustration, but it drives a point, which is how do we define what the appropriate compensation is? And I don't think there's a real answer we're going to reach, obviously. And I think the reason why I bring this up is, well, the jurisdictional difference is very, very real in that sense. So Ontario is going to have a very different sense of what appropriate compensation is, and that's enacted in the law. Texas, for example, is going to have a very different set of the appropriate compensation is. So in Ontario, I can tell you that, a 50-50 is a bit of a myth in that it's not actually 50-50 down the line, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. But for argument's sake, let's say it's 50-50. I would say overall, Ontario's closer to that 50-50 regime than other jurisdictions. It is. Ontario is a very, very recipient-friendly jurisdiction, if you will. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of men or payors who feel very, very unhappy about the fact that they have to dole out a lot of money to the other person. But that's part of what makes family law so conflictual, difficult, and in a way interesting, I guess, because there's no black and white answer. And every case is different. Every case is different.
I like the concept of 50-50 fundamentally. And I think it's a good starting point. I think that we need to have context, and that's what lawyers are for. That's what court is for. That's what negotiations are for. But I think that what you can't not talk about is what men, obviously some men, see as her value. So she made lunches So she makes lunch and I have to, and it's like, if she was a stay-at-home parent, raised the children, did the pickups, the drop-offs, the childcare, the making Halloween costumes, doing the dishes, the meals, hosting your clients, playing trophy wife, all those things, pressed your suits, made sure you can go and travel on business. That's what gave you your success in your career. So it's mind-blowing to me that men are like, yeah, but that's not worth anything. Meanwhile, who climbed the career ladder while she stayed home and she has no skills or less skills or a massive gap in her resume. But the idea that these types of men that we're talking about don't value women's labor. So then, of course, when the divorce comes, it's like, now she gets 50-50. This is crazy. She gets my kids. And it's like, she gets what was happening during the marriage, right? You made the money.
Yeah.
You supported her. She helped and dealt with the kids. And now you want to give her nothing, have her go back to work and split the kids when that was never the deal in the marriage. So that's sort of status quo. Men don't, abusive
my
men
whole
don't like
deal
that.
is, people, like I personally have no stance in terms of, people should strive to be more equitable in a relationship and they should try to be more independent. Other than for issues of safety, obviously, I always encourage people to have some level of independence because otherwise, if you depend on them too much, you risk yourself. But beyond that, like if somebody says to me, you know what, like I aspire to be a stay-at-home wife and I want to support my husband, and on the other side of that is a man saying to me, I want a stay-at-home wife. Like I want somebody to stay home, do all the domestic duties. I actually have zero issues with that. In the same way that I have no issues with other people, more modern people, I suppose, saying like, I want to work. Like I don't want to be at stay-at-home, whatever. But the only thing is, people need to remember you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? And so that means if you're a man that says, I want my wife to stay at home and to bear my children and raise my children and do all these things that a traditional wife is supposed to do, then you're going to have to take on a pretty traditional role as a man. And that means in the event of separation, you need to continue to provide for this woman that you promised that you would provide for, right? Like you don't get to have the benefits for a period of, let's say, 10 years that you've been married. And after that, since you're getting a divorce, you get none of the consequences, right? Or the carrying, continuing responsibilities. So I think if people were just realistic about the situation that they're in and what they're choosing to do, I think we wouldn't have as much conflict. But I think the problem is people generally want to have their cake and eat it too.
Makes sense though. And again, you look at this type of man who is entitled, because entitlement is the biggest driver of abuse. If he's entitled to have the stay-at-home wife and everything that comes with, but then he's entitled also, he only provides, he only protects, allegedly. Abusive men are not neither of those things, but it's contingent on the transaction of you performing the good wife. And then when you decide to get divorced because he's been abusive or neglectful, boom, you are persona non grata in his life, and that's it. You are the enemy, and he wants you to have nothing. And it's interesting that men talk about women gaining in divorce when, there's actually this kind of conversation around like who benefits from marriage. It's men. Like, period, full stop. Every study proves that men benefit more from marriage, and then men are like, no, women do. They mean divorce. They mean that women benefit in divorce. But what's interesting is women don't. Like the studies actually show that financially, and again, overall, not talking about your clients, women don't benefit from divorce. Having said that, the benefits are, in my opinion, happiness, because women who are not married, whether that's divorced or never married, are happier. Women who are childless are happier. And I say that with 2 kids and I'm engaged, I realize, but women are happier. And so I think abusive men are a little bit jealous of that. They get a little pissed off that their ex-wives are actually happier with or without alimony. And alimony and spousal support, that's paid in like less than 10% of divorces. And yet men think all women walk away with this balloon of money. It's wild to me.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I guess that also depends on the jurisdiction. Like, I don't know the number of, so in Canada, we call it spousal support, same thing as alimony, but I don't know the percentage of cases where a spouse will walk away with a spousal support.
One of
my favorites. Yeah. And which jurisdiction are you in, Lisa?
Ontario.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, I see. Okay, yeah. Yeah. No, that's an interesting stat. I actually didn't know that.
Yeah. It's a Canadian stat versus an Ontario stat, but it's the same in the US, but it's less than 10%. And of those payers, some are women. Obviously, the majority is men, but women pay it too, which is painful for a woman who might have been the breadwinner and now she has to pay her abuser in a divorce. how's she winning in
Yeah.
that case? I can't see that. That's crazy.
Yeah. I think one of the most common questions I get is, what can I do to protect myself in a marriage, whether they're in a marriage now or whether they're looking to get into a marriage. And I always tell them, like, look, there is only so much the law can do for you. It's just what it is. Your best protection is to marry the right person in the first place. And I realize that's a lot harder to implement in action than to talk about. However, I do think that there is an element of people not taking the time to suss out the other person. I think people fall in love a bit too easily, especially when they're younger and they've got the rose-colored glasses on. I mean, how many stories do we know of, oh my God, he was great when we were dating, but as soon as we got married, he was a different person. It's a very, very common story. And if nothing else, you know what? Get a prenup. Seriously. Here's the thing about, marrying a potential abuser and getting a prenup. People think like the value of a prenup is what you end up writing on the agreement, which it is valuable, obviously. But in my opinion, the real value in getting a prenup is the process of talking about this with your spouse and finding out really when it comes down to it, like what kind of person are you, right? Like I'll just tell a quick story to drive this point home, which is, I had a client who, was engaged, was going to get married, and she was living with currently her fiance. The fiance had 2 kids of his own, so she was home. She was about to quit her job, and she was going to raise these 2 children. And we proceeded to try and get a prenup done. And the other side had proposed in an agreement that while she's married to him and living in his house, caring for his 2 young children, that she would have to pay rent to him and that she would get no support, no property, no nothing in the event of a divorce. And so you can imagine the type of conversation that people were having once that agreement came through, which was, what the hell are you talking about, right?
Wow.
And that was not the kind of person that she thought she was marrying, right? And so it's very, very easy when you're in the dating stage to sort of play this character, I think, that is trying to woo you and love bomb you and what have you. But like, again, when push comes to shove and like when things get real, as in you're about to put ink on paper that says, in the event of a divorce, legally, this is what I'm going to do for you. This is what's going to happen. Like they can't lie anymore, right? And so, and on the flip side of that, I have many other really happy, just couples who decide to get a prenup and they're like even more generous than I would want them to be. I'm like, legally, you don't have to be like this generous, but they're like, no, but like she's going to be my wife or he's going to be my husband. Like I want them to be supported and I want them to feel like they're getting an equitable outcome out of this relationship. And so like, I want to do it. Like that also exists. And if that's the case, like good on you, like I can't be happier for you. Right. But like, seriously, I think people underestimate the value, or they don't quite realize that the real value in getting a prenup is not just what you end up putting on the agreement, but the process in and of itself. And you get to really see what the other person's made of.
Yeah. I feel like the takeaway from that little bit there is divorce lawyer says prenups are going to help you determine what kind of person, because you can't hide anymore. You can't lie. Oh, baby, I'll take care of you. Don't worry. Oh, we're never going to get divorced. But if we do, I'm just curious, what would this actually look like? I think more people, like what I've learned over the last 5 years working in the domestic violence realm and even just talking to people about how you exit these relationships, I sing the praises of prenups left, right, and center. And when I was in my 20s, I was always kind of like, prenups are so icky. Who wants to talk about divorce while you're getting married? And now I see it as that's exactly when you should be talking about those things. But if you make it a legal conversation, there's no, baby, I love you, I'll take care of you. Show me. Write that down. I love that.
Exactly. Yeah.
You'll pull out the abusers right there that are like, okay, yeah, I'll take care of you. Here, you can have spousal support for 6 months. Yeah, and then you get nothing. You'll expose them. You'll expose them.
Yeah.
I have a little part of this podcast called Real Talk from the comments. You probably get all kinds of comments on social media. Me too.
A lot.
A lot. Yes. And, I see amazing comments and I see like the worst of the worst comments. So I'm going to read you 2 comments relating to this topic of divorce. And I just want to hear your thoughts. So one of the comments, of course, over 70% of divorces are filed by women. They get everything out of it. Alimony, child support, the house, the kids. Well, the man's life gets ruined and he has to pay for her hair and nails. Brutal.
Again, very, very well. I can understand why someone might feel that way. Like subjectively, I get it. But, there are consequences to everyone's actions, let's say. And one of my favorite phrases is, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and that applies to literally anything. And, if you're a person who benefited from the marriage in some way, and you might not like to acknowledge that you benefited from the marriage, but you definitely have. And there's a price to pay for that. That's not to say that everything's transactional, but that's just the way life works. And the same thing goes for the other person, like the price they pay for the hair and nails, I suppose, to use that example, post-divorce is that you gave up your independence probably during your marriage. You know what I mean? Like again, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I think people will be better served to realize that.
Yeah. One thing that always kind of surprises me when men are like, oh, and I have to pay alimony, which again is paid in less than 10%. So I just want to flip that. 90% of divorces, there's no alimony typically being paid. I believe these stats, I've looked into them, I've seen all the sources. But the point is that if it's being paid, there's a reason. And we all know where we get married and where we live and all the jurisdictions. So if you really are so concerned about if in the event of a divorce that she's going to get alimony, get her to sign a prenup before the marriage. Tell her, be honest and upfront before the marriage and say, if we ever split up, even though I expect that you are a stay-at-home parent, that I want you to have nothing in divorce. Be honest.
Also, you gotta pick up your and on beyond that, you have to arrange your life in a way. You arrange your marriage in a way that makes it very, very obvious that, you know what, it wasn't like one person was sacrificing themselves for the other person. And that means nowadays, like double income household is probably more common than not. And so, when you come home as a man and your wife also works, by the way, do the dishes, take care of the children, do the laundry. Like you partake in the things that typically women do that entitles them to spousal support if you're so concerned, right?
Yeah. But you also might avoid divorce by doing that, by the way.
And that's exactly it, right? It's like, I think, I believe part of the reason why the divorce rate is so high and why relationships fail is because we overemphasize the moment in which we get married and how that is a moment beginning the forever happily ever after from that point on. And people take for granted the relationship and the marriage that they are in. And as soon as somebody takes something for granted, they are not going to give it the care and the attention that it deserves. And if in your mind, because you said I do at the altar, that the other person, no matter what you do, is not going to leave you, they'll probably leave you because you're not going to treat them right. And so, and that's the thing about prenups too. It's like, yeah, you think that talking about a divorce is going to make you get a divorce. That's such a faulty logic, right? In fact, I would argue if you're talking about the potential that you might get divorced and what's going to happen in the event of a divorce, you are going to acknowledge the possibility that it might happen, and therefore you're going to put in the requisite care to make sure it doesn't happen, right? Like the other person, like for both people, like another human being saying to you, I'm going to commit myself to you is not something that comes for free, right? Yeah. It's a huge, huge sacrifice and commitment from the other person that you have to respect, and there needs to be reciprocal effort for it to work. And I think people forget that, or people were never taught that.
Yeah, I absolutely think that. I think, abusive people exploit that. They don't want to have these conversations about getting yourself organized. The amount of people that are like, how did you, in comment sections, how are these women getting married, never having had these conversations? You'd be surprised how many people, men and women, are not having these conversations. And I honestly, my new advice, I'll quote you on this, but I really feel like prenups are going to expose the liars. More women should be asking for prenups, not because they're trying to get money, right? But just sort of like suss out what kind of person you are.
Put your money where your mouth is,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. One more comment to wrap it up. It's a comment that stuck with me, and I pulled this off specifically for this episode because it irks me. It's such a red pill comment. Men stay because they're loyal. Men choose their families over their own happiness, and women choose their own happiness over their families. That's why marriages fall apart.
I think, again, men are just a bit more obtuse, and I don't say that to be critical. I think biologically, I think that is true. I think women are more complex in their mind than men are. And another element to that is a lot of the times women are the ones suffering in the relationship, and it's not an equal amount of suffering, right? And so the other person might say, like, I am literally working, providing for you financially. Like, what more could you want? Meanwhile, the wife is saying, like, but I don't want you to work so much to the point where all I have is money, but I don't have your presence. I have to do everything by myself at home. I don't feel loved. I don't feel valued. I don't feel like my own self anymore.
Yeah.
Like then
You
you
lose
can see the
yourself.
disconnect, right? So it's not like, and I think also this idea that people get divorced so easily, like they kind of make it sound like a woman will wake up one day and think like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to get a divorce because you know what? I value my happiness over this family. But like the reality is that was an agonizing process to try and come to that conclusion. And most of the time, in my experience anyway, like the women really have thought very, very, very long and hard about whether they want to go through it or not. And let's be clear, by getting a divorce, they are also subjecting themselves to a lot of consequences. And it's not all butterflies and rainbows for them either. In fact, it's probably the opposite. Like it's the uncertainty. You're going to have to uproot your entire life. You're going to have to jump into this process of uncertainty that might not get you what you think you're entitled to. There's also this element of, stigma that people have against divorced women. And now you have to tell your friends and family that you're like, what do you mean? Somebody just wakes up and says like, I feel like I'm going to divorce you today because I choose myself over you. Like that's not a thing that happens, right? And I think perhaps that also then goes to show how oblivious men can be. Now, in saying all this, I do want to make it very, very clear. Like there are plenty of women that I deal with that are very toxic. There are plenty of men. Like it's not necessarily an all gendered issue, but it is true that on the whole, that there still exists that gender specific issues that we still need to do a lot of work at to try and resolve.
I think so. I think with this kind of comment, even what I see is like men's willingness to be miserable. Like you get married and that sucks. She made me, it all fits into that trope of like she tricked him into marriage, or meanwhile he asked her, he bought the ring, he showed up to the wedding, maybe paid for the wedding, and there you are married. But it's just this sort of like, I hate my wife, I hate being married. Men accept that instead of choosing happiness. So if it's true, I don't think that it is true that women choose their own happiness over their families. Women are miserable and they don't think that raising their children and continuing to be miserable and making that the generational thing that we all do. I think choosing your happiness is smart. So like number one, I think it's dumb to stay unhappy, but I also don't think that it's true. So men's choice to stay miserable, like that's dumb. You should stop that. You should get divorced. If you're unhappy in your marriage, divorce her. That just doesn't make sense to me
100%.
To stay unhappy. Why choose that? It's brutal. These topics of divorce, and it's hard. I mean, both genders can be abusive. It's not who my audience is dealing with. We're dealing with abusive men over here, but we know that it can kind of go around and that the tactics that are used in divorce proceedings are brutal, dragging it out, financial abuse. It's absolutely awful. You see a lot as a divorce lawyer that I guess therapists maybe missed in the marriage, but it's hard. Divorce is sucky no matter what. I think even when it's the right thing for the couple to get divorced,
No,
it's
100%.
still hard.
Yeah. And that's exactly the point, right? Like this idea that divorce is so easy and somebody would choose that over something else so easily. It's not like that's not the case at all. Like it's divorce. I'm not exaggerating when I say this can be one of the most traumatic experiences that anybody goes through in their lifetime. And to think that someone might choose that so easily is just not right.
Accurate.
And like, look, I mean, I guess as a closing remark, I want to just tell people, reiterate the point that you really need to find the right person in the first place, because there's no amount of law or intervention that is going to change the person that you've married. And look, despite all this conversation, I think marriage is a beautiful thing. And I wholeheartely believe believe in the value of marriage. And I think having children personally is though I don't have children yet, but I certainly I have plans to, can be the most rewarding thing that anybody can do with their lives. But you got to educate yourself, and you've got to not take what Disney says is the idea of a romance and apply that to your own life. Because you know what? Real life is not like, it's not a fairy tale. Real life is full of consequences. Real life marriage is more like a business transaction. And I know that sounds very unromantic and unsexy, but you know what? If you want to continue to believe that marriage is supposed to be this like butterflies and rainbows and we're never going to get divorced, well, talk to Lisa and she'll tell you all about how that went wrong. And talk to me. We will both tell them about how wrong that can go. Again, the best protection you can set for yourself is to marry the right person in the first place. Not easy, I understand, but there is certainly a lot more that people can do than they are doing right now. Talk to a lawyer, get a prenup, do your research, and also value yourself. If you know in the back of your mind that the other person has these tendencies that are I don't know about that, really hone in on that, right? And then address that. I'm not saying right away, if you see, as soon as you sign any signs, walk away. I'm not saying that, right? But you can't ignore it, right? You can't ignore it.
And we do. Honestly, we do. I talk to so many women who are like, I didn't see it. And then you start talking about it and they're like, oh, I totally saw things, which is a whole different topic. I have many episodes on that topic of how we miss what's really going on. But there are ways to sort of suss it out. And I think slowing down is a good one and getting a prenup is a good one. So appreciate that advice so much. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
No,
and I'm going
so
to tag
fun.
your socials.
I really appreciate it. And look, I know I already gave my closing remark, but just one more, because I realize now people might hear what we said and kind of put a lot of pressure on themselves for getting themselves into this situation in the first place. And I just want to say to them, you know what, you need to exercise a lot more grace to yourself, right? We're all human, and it's a lot easier for myself and yourself, Lisa, to sit here where we are and then as a third party person, criticize and kind of talk about what should have been done, what could have been done. But when you're in that moment, as everybody knows, it's not that easy and it's not that clear. And so I don't want anybody to hear this episode and blame themselves or put so much pressure that they haven't done the right thing. You need to be gracious with yourself, but look forward, be forward thinking. At any stage in this process, there's something you can do to help yourself. And if today is that day, then great.
Yeah. That's amazing. I'm glad you said that, because I definitely don't want people to feel like, you picked the wrong. People lie, and that's how we get into this. But it's just a matter of giving ourselves the grace. And I always say that looking back is really hard because you know more now. So you look back and you think, oh, why did I do that? I knew better. You didn't at the time. You know better now.
That's right.
Move forward. It'll be okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll tag your socials so people can follow you. Thanks for being here.
Of course. Thanks, Lisa.